Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to have a discussion about fantasy and fantasy romance. I'm kind of rooting this whole conversation from this one little spark of something that occurred last year, which is that for those of you who maybe you don't actually care that much about the Goodreads Choice Awards, I know I don't take it that seriously, but maybe you enjoy being a part of the conversation, seeing people's reactions, all those sorts of things, and maybe you do contribute to what you think would make them better so that perhaps in the future you would take them more seriously. Regardless, if you are in the know about the Goodreads Choice Awards, then you know that finally last year they did have a formal divide between fantasy and fantasy romance, or romantasy as it is sometimes called. And a lot of us had been wanting this for quite a long time as the fantasy romance subgenre, because that's what we would have considered it at that time. I think now it is its own formal genre, regardless of the Goodreads Choice Awards nominees' decision. I think it really is its own genre at this point. But regardless, the fandoms and the readers of those, they are very easily consumed, they're accessible, they become really popular online, and of course the Goodreads Choice Awards, that's basically what it is. It's a popularity contest, which is fine. It's kind of interesting to gauge and see how books and our current society are coming together and what appeals to people and what does not. So that can be an interesting thing to examine. And as a result, though, of fantasy romance being something that's a little more accessible, it meets at a crossroads between two popular genres, which would be fantasy and romance, and thus has such a large following that any time a prominent fantasy romance author was having a release from the year that the Goodreads Choice Awards was taking part in, there was pretty much always a guarantee that that author would win. And usually that author was Sarah J. Maas, right? And a lot of times people were like, okay, no shade to her books, but I kind of feel like fantasy and fantasy romance feel so distinct at this point that we should have a separate category, not because the fantasy fans were like, I'm mad about, they weren't being sore losers. It was just that fantasy romance deserves to have its own category. There's so many readers, and when you have it mixed with just fantasy, that can mean so many different things. And I think a lot of people come to the Goodreads Choice Awards and they try to discover books outside their bubble. Maybe you are in a certain niche within the genre or subgenre that you like, and then you don't even know about certain books. You don't even know they exist until the Goodreads Choice Awards nominees comes out. And other things, of course, too. There's plenty of people online who do a good job of hyping up other books. It's not like we only get recommendations from that. But when you are somebody who loves fantasy romance, you would have that big name. You would have Sarah J. Maas. Sometimes you would have Jennifer L. Armentrout or maybe one of the other ones. And then after that, it was basically nothing. So everything else would be epic fantasy, military fantasy, political fantasy. And for people that love fantasy romance, and it is a lot of people, there really weren't any other books that they could look to and be like, oh, well, I liked this, so let me check this out now too. So I am really happy that they now have an entire section, and for people who are looking to dip their toes in fantasy romance, that's also a great thing for them, because now we all pretty much, if we're in fantasy circles, have heard of Sarah J. Maas. So it's like, okay, yeah, I know about her, but what about the other ones? And I know for myself, for a lot of you as well, and just a lot of fantasy readers in general, we aren't opposed to checking out fantasy romance. We want to check out fantasy romance. We just don't really know where to start. And fantasy romance has a lot of subgenres, just like other genres do, where sometimes it's more smut, sometimes it's more sweet, sometimes it is more political, sometimes the fantasy elements do play a bigger role. And so we're kind of wanting to explore that, just like any other subgenre of fantasy. And so I really was happy for that divide. It also allowed for other things to shine within the fantasy category, which was great. But there are some other additions to this that are pros, and there are some other additions that are cons. And when I talk about this divide, I want to be clear that while I've been focusing on Goodreads, there have been times where I've walked into a bookstore and now they truly have a separate section dedicated to fantasy romance than they do from fantasy. Usually it's science fiction fantasy, or sometimes even just science fiction, and then the fantasy books go there, and then the fantasy romance is in its own place, or maybe it's around where the romance books are. So this divide is becoming more formal all around, at least from what I've seen. Maybe it's been different where you live or the bookstores that you wander into. But regardless, I wanted to dive into some of the things that I think are great about this, aside from and I should say outside of Goodreads, as well as some things that I'm a little worried about, actually. And I thought it could be interesting to then kind of toss this conversation to you, and in the comments you can add your additional thoughts. So I'll start with the pro of having these split, having these genres now distinctly separate. So the first one is it just makes it easier for you to find what you're looking for. I kind of touched on this already, but if you are somebody who loves fantasy, it's pretty easy to go online and look up various different subgenres, because there are entire pages dedicated to, are you looking for this? Are you looking for the political fantasy? Are you looking for the military fantasy? Are you looking for a heist story? You can type in pretty much any of those things and they'll come up. Because fantasy romance previously was seen as just a subgenre, then any fantasy romance book could go in one of those lists, even though they can be so drastically different from one another. So now if you're like political fantasy romance or military fantasy romance, those same labels, but just say fantasy romance instead of just fantasy, now you might finally be able to see how these are broken apart, and you can see the way in which that genre might actually have some things to offer to you, because some people, if they're in their fantasy bubble, they're like, well, I don't think there's anything. I've tried like one or two and they were really, there's this certain tropes and trends that are really popular, and maybe that's not your thing. But there probably are a lot of books. I mean, when we think about some of our favorite fantasy series, a lot of times there are distinct couples in those. If you are somebody like me who loves Mistborn, there's a couple in that a lot of people at the end of the day are like, are actually one of my favorite couples when you think about it. Or when you have something like The Witcher, and I more so am thinking about the video games, but when you think about like Geralt and Yennefer, it's like, yeah, they're such a distinct couple, and they're interesting and unique, and they feel like their own characters, but they come together through so much, and them with Ciri as found family. And so there's these couples that are iconic to a lot of us, and they're not considered fantasy romance. So it's not that we're opposed to reading a good romantic subplot in a book, or maybe even it does become a fairly big part of the story. It's just that what we currently think of when we think of fantasy romance is kind of narrow, but there is so much out there to offer. And so by having this formal separation, we can find what we're looking for a little bit easier. I want to go back and forth between the pros and the cons, so I'm going to jump into the cons, one of the first ones, and this is a topic that I think could very easily get into some sticky territory, we'll say. Perhaps people have certain emotions that immediately come up. But I think a lot of you are really mature, and this won't go south quickly. I think that this will maintain its maturity as we discuss this. But the divide between men and women. I think that fantasy romance currently is seen as a genre that women like, and fantasy is seen as a genre that men like, and then like sometimes women like too. But fantasy romance is not something most people, I think, instinctively associate with men. And what makes me a little worried is that whether you agree or disagree, this is just my observation, and my observation as a gal, a lot of times the things that are typically associated with women are also then associated with mockery, being thought of as less than. And it's not that there aren't things that men haven't had the same experience with as well. I think back in the day, fantasy was seen as like, this is for middle-aged men that live in their basement with their mom, and they dress a certain way and they look a certain way. And it was very cruel, and it was very much like, you can't be a normal person, and it was not kind at all. And then fantasy has become more mainstream, and now that image, I think, has definitely, or at least that stereotype and that negativity has lessened. However, for a long time, things like YA books, which were often associated with young girls, teenage girls, they would be ripped apart, criticized, and just looked down upon, and would be seen as lesser. And I think there is just something that is very, this again could go into a whole other discussion, but people don't question sometimes why it is that we feel so comfortable hating on these things, when I think some of it is the root of some of it is that it's an activity that is enjoyed predominantly by women. And yeah, Fantasy romance right now, I'm not necessarily saying I think that it's the most gorgeous writing I've ever heard. Some of it is about the smut. Some of it is about the pining, and the writing isn't necessarily the main focus. But how many fantasy authors who are really successful and that some of us actually really like, how many of them have also said, I'm not actually focused on the writing itself? And some of them maybe have even used the stained glass window analogy, that some people, when you're looking out the window to this beautiful world, some of them want to focus on the world, so they keep the window very plain, you could say, very easy to look through. The window doesn't matter, it's what's outside the window, aka the story, the plot, the characters, the world. And then some authors, the window represents the writing, and so it's going to be stained glass, it's going to be gorgeous, it's going to be beautiful, and then also the world outside can be beautiful too, or maybe it's going to be a little more simplistic, it's the writing that really matters to them. How many of us have heard that analogy? And you probably already know which author is associated with that analogy. And not really, and maybe even found yourself getting defensive when people are like, yeah, but the writing isn't the best, the writing, and you're like, yeah, but the stories and all these other things. But when it's the focus is, yeah, but people falling in love, yeah, but look at this representation of trauma within relationships and these intimate things that sometimes feel very isolating, but it can help people, it can be cathartic for people who've experienced this. It's like, but it's just smut. It's like, we lessen what some of the impact can be over here. It's not to say you're not allowed to criticize. It's not to say that you can't have your own personal tastes. I don't mean that at all. You don't have to like something that isn't appealing to you. It's just sometimes we instinctively seem to be comfortable mocking the things that are typically associated with women, and we start to respect and just kind of subconsciously grant more praise to the things that are more so associated with men. Not always, I want to be clear, not always. This is just what I've observed currently with some of the trends that are occurring right now. YA, we've I think come very far from shaming people who read YA, looking down at YA, assuming less of YA just all around, whether you read it often or not. But fantasy romance, I fear that it's going to start getting that same treatment, and that that it's just going to cause this divide. And what I really want to emphasize is that it's really fine for you to have the subgenre tastes that you have. It's really fine to like certain things in books, and it's completely fine to not like other things. And if that means you, more often than not, fit in a box that is stereotypically associated with a certain gender, that's okay. As long as there's not just this inherent looking down upon something when it's not something you're that experienced with. And also just let people like what they like. If they don't really like something, that's fine. If they like something, that's fine. And the reason I talk about this divide as well is that I think even, I'm going to say this as a girl speaking for a lady. I know some people don't like when girl is tied to like a grown person. But anyway, as somebody who is a lady, I do think that we as women, I don't want to act as though like, men just are the only ones that sometimes outside they shame us for things we like and we don't contribute at all. Women do it too. And like, ask yourself if you've ever done this, because I feel like I've done it. A lot of us have done it. We did it growing up, and we do it now. We don't even think about it. It just comes out. Not necessarily fantasy romance, but any romance in any medium, in any story of any extent. Have you ever heard yourself or another lady say, I don't really like romance in my books. I don't really care about the romance. I don't really want romance. How many times have you heard somebody say something to that extent? Why do we care so much about the relationship building between friends in books? Why do we care so much about the relationship building between parents and their children, mentor, mentee? Why do we care about aunts and their nieces and nephews? Why do we care about all these other forms of relationships being developed really well? Why do we want to see ourselves in characters? Why do we want to explore relationships in a realistic way, except in romance? Why? Romance does not have to take over the plot. It's fair to say I don't want suddenly this plot that is all about saving the world to come second to these characters wanting to sleep together, right? Pretty much none of us like that because it's so unrealistic and stupid. And you're like, okay, these characters are dumb. But if it is a part, just like all the other relationships, if it's a part of a human being's existence in a story, and it's done in a way that is compelling, it's well fleshed out, it's intentional, it is nuanced. Why is it that the second there's something that is romance, we're like, oh, but I liked it until suddenly there was this romance and there's just this negativity surrounding it. And it's like, why are we so opposed to falling in love? Why are we so opposed to characters falling in love? And I know not literally everyone, of course, because obviously fantasy romance is popular for a reason. But I mean, what is it about some of us that is our instinct? Why is it that we have to act like it's a negative to explore realistic, and oftentimes things that so many of us, even if we don't relate to, our friends have gone through something like that, or our parents went through something like that. Why is it that we are so hesitant to just be like, I really liked the relationship between this couple, and I was glad that the author took the time to develop this? Why is it that we don't want to give our usual nuanced takes on those things, and all we want to say is, I don't really like romance in my books? Is it that you really don't like romances in books, or is it that there's this perception that to like that is somehow less than, it's frivolous, it's trivial? So you have to care about the military components, you have to care about the action, you have to care about the friendship, but romance? No. Why? That's why I want to ask, why? It's fair to say it's not done well if you think it's done poorly, if you think that suddenly everything else didn't matter in the book, or that the author got lazy with everything else. All those are legitimate criticisms, but we do find that sometimes we instinctively just say, I don't really like romances in my books, and I don't know if that's necessarily true, and I want us to ask ourselves that question. And the reason I'm highlighting this as a con is because I think that concept of women, but also men, anybody, being like, I don't like romances, they might actually like a fantasy romance book, but they're going to instinctively be like, ugh, and they're just going to act like it's less than to appear a certain way to, if you're somebody who's online, to your audience, or if you're talking to random people, I don't know, in a book club, or if you're in a Reddit thread or something like that. Like, you're not cool. So hopefully people don't fall into this trap of, let me just make fun of this thing because it's really easy to do so, and not apply that same level of intense criticism to things that are just categorized as fantasy. It should be whatever your level of criticism is, the amount that you put into it, it should be for everything that you pick up. Now getting back to the pros. Makes it easier to find readers with similar interests. So there are, of course, so many of us that grew up loving books, loving stories, and because the internet was not as big of a thing back in the day, we felt like reading was such an isolating hobby, and it was like we would experience these intense emotions because reading can bring out so much in us. We would experience these intense emotions and then just be like, there's nobody to talk to about this. And we would try to talk to like our parents or our friends, and they would just be like, okay. And if you found that person as a kid, if you found another person who had interest in the stories that you liked, it was like, oh my gosh. And it didn't matter if you and that person really personality-wise didn't get along that well, or maybe you got along fine, but you wouldn't have, it didn't matter because they liked that same thing as you, and so you could relate about that experience. I still remember as a kid, even though this is not a book, but all of you know, I'm sure at this point, that I love Final Fantasy X, which, by the way, speaking of a great couple, oh my gosh, and fantasy and romance done well. Anyway, so I'm getting sidetracked, but I love Final Fantasy X. I think all of you know that at this point because I talk about it all the time. And as a kid, we didn't have internet, even when internet became more of a thing that was in most households. We couldn't afford it. So anytime my sister, she was 5 years older than me, if she had like a paper that she had to do, if I had a paper I had to do, we would go to the library. And if it was one of those instances where I didn't have something to do, but my sister did, I would literally just search pictures of Final Fantasy X on the internet. Even though I'd played the game, and I also had a Game Informer magazine, and anytime they talked about Final Fantasy X, I would cut out pictures. And on my door, I'd cut out so many pictures from my video game magazines that I spelled out Final Fantasy and then a big X 10 because I was obsessed, and I still am a little bit. But anyway, this little nerdy child that I had nobody to talk to about it, and so I would just like type in like Final Fantasy X, and I'd go to images and be like, wow, and just be so happy looking at these pictures. And basically the thing is, there wasn't another person who was like, I also love this thing, and for us to all geek out over. And geeking out over stories that we love is just, it's the best. It's such a great feeling. You're like, oh, I found my people. And the fact that we are getting this more formal split really helps people find each other. And I think that is a lovely, lovely thing. I know I was just saying with the first con that I'm worried that it's going to divide us, but also sometimes we can find people when we really get down to specifics. We can find people that love these same things. I think that's why trope marketing has become such a thing, is because they're highlighting the specifics that all of us maybe weren't putting a name to, like, oh my gosh, I love when this happens in books. Before we weren't putting a name to it, but now we're having marketing put a name to it, and then it's kind of appealing to those specifics that previously we didn't realize everybody loves. And now we're all tired of it because we're like, yeah, we know. But regardless, I do think sometimes when you can bond over those very random specific things, you can find some really great friendships out of that, and you can share in a love of something, and that I think is wonderful. I'm going to go through the next 2 cons so that we end on a positive. The next one is just miscategorizations, one or the other. This can happen in both. So I've seen, I think one of you even mentioned recently that you saw Assassin's Apprentice categorized as a fantasy romance. That is not a fantasy romance even a little bit. Maybe the second one, kinda. No, not even really. It's just there is a big emphasis on Fitz and this girl that he likes, but oh my gosh, is the first one not a fantasy romance? He's a child, so that's so weird. Why did a bookstore have that in the fantasy romance section? I don't understand. And I remember you saying you lost it when you saw that. And yeah, I saw your comment and I was like, what? So miscategorization, and I think this can happen on the opposite end. There's something that is fantasy romance, but it's put in fantasy, and so then it's ending up in the hands of maybe somebody who isn't really interested, which every now and then that can be a good thing, because somebody can have picked something up not thinking it was something else, and then they end up really enjoying it, and that's nice when that happens. However, generally we have these genres for a reason. It's so that people know where to go to find the thing that they like, and when you have what feels like this deception or just this mistake made, you end up getting people who pick up something, they're like, oh, I don't like this. And then sometimes they can rate the book negatively, or they can review the book negatively because it's not what they were looking for. And that's kind of, I don't want to say it's unfair to the book, because that happens all the time, but it does feel like, oh, if the book had found its audience, then it's more likely to be something that people would enjoy. So, because can you imagine being a fantasy romance reader and picking up Assassin's Apprentice and being like, what? This isn't fantasy romance? Of course that person's going to be like, I didn't get any romance, so I didn't really enjoy this, and that's what I was here for. Anyway, I think there are books that kind of sit right in between, and the miscategorization, or just it falling in one or the other, it kind of makes me sad that those books that have a great blend and really are somewhere in the middle, that based off of where it gets placed, it can lose some of its audience, and it might have otherwise been a great crossover book. It might have been that. The same way we talk about, oh, if you typically read YA, here are some good books to go into adult fantasy, or if you typically read adult fantasy, here are some books that you might like that are YA, these like transition books. I think that those might get lost a little bit. Hopefully not. Maybe you'll just start seeing lists that are like that, the intro to fantasy romance, or the intro to fantasy if you are a fantasy romance reader. And then last for the cons, okay, there are things about, I want to explain before I just read off what I wrote in my notes. There are things about fantasy romance that I think most people come to expect when they pick up a fantasy romance book. The same can be said for fantasy. However, and this ties back to my conversation that I was having about why do we care so much about friendships, about familial bonds, about mentor-mentee, why do we care about those things, but then we're like, oh, but romance, no, I don't, and we get all weird about it. So, fantasy romance is not an excuse for a poorly written fantasy world. The world should still make sense. It's okay if you don't have this deep, rich lore, if it's not super epic. That's completely fine. But the stakes cannot just be random. You can't have the world not make any sense. The magic shouldn't make no sense at all, and use the excuse of, well, but that's not the focus. It doesn't matter if that's not the focus. It's not realistic, and it's lazy. So don't make excuses just because that's not the main reason why people are coming to your... If you're going to have fantasy in your book, then have fantasy in your book. Otherwise, make a contemporary romance book. Contemporary romance books are great and a lot of people love them, and you don't have to worry about the fantasy elements. But if you're going to have the fantasy elements, because imagine if you didn't have fantasy elements and you use that same excuse, right? If you have our world and the everyday, like let's say you're like, I am somebody who lives in Arizona, USA, but this book is going to take place in Switzerland, and I'm talking about how it's so hot in Switzerland, people would be like, you don't know anything about Switzerland, right? Because, and if I was like, yeah, but that's not the point of the book. Okay, the setting has to make sense. That's the whole point I'm making. The setting still has to make sense. If you're going to use fantasy elements, make sure that they're good. Now, the reverse, in some sense, can be said of fantasy books. Writing fantasy is not an excuse to write really bad relationships. And people will say, it doesn't, well, if you, I've seen people say this, people have said this to me when I've criticized a poorly written, in my opinion, a poorly written relationship in a book. People say, well, if you're looking for romance, go read fantasy romance or go read a romance book. And I'm like, no, I'm not looking for a romance. I'm saying if you're going to include a romance, make it not suck. It's not that it's not difficult, because it is difficult to portray relationships well. If you're gonna put it in there, then do a decent job. You don't even have to have it. It's not like you have to spend a ton of time on it. It's okay if you have characters, because there are times where characters will have a very brief interaction, and that brief interaction, we're like, oh my gosh, they're in love. And we as readers, like, we can pick up on it. Some authors are masterful at that. You do not need to spend the whole book. It doesn't need to consume everything. It's just the little ways in which you write. You can really analyze that and put it into a book really well. And I think a good example is there's a certain couple in Full Metal Alchemist. I know not everybody's a manga anime person, but there's a certain couple in Full Metal Alchemist literally never has a romantic moment in the entire series. You do not see them as a couple. It's not even really hinted at that they're a couple. Everyone thinks they're a couple. They're like the ultimate ship. Everybody loves them. Everybody like hyper focuses on the smallest of things. In the anime, there's a part where the woman is injured and the guy, like when he goes to hug her, he like squeezes her a little bit, and people will be like, oh my gosh, the way he like squeezed her in that moment. And people get so excited about it. And it really is basically canon to a lot of people, even though you never actually see them together. So it is possible. You do not have to write two people and you're constantly in their head about, do I love this person? Why do I love this person? Look how beautiful this person is. That doesn't need to be how it's done. But if you're going to include it, just like everything else, put some effort into it. And if you are a reader of that genre, if you're a reader of fantasy and somebody is being critical of that, don't immediately find, well, you can do whatever you want, I suppose. But try to fight the urge, I would encourage, to just immediately have that, well, then just go read a romance, because that's not actually analyzing the complexity that the reader, the reviewer, is looking for and that we should want in our stories. Now back to the last pro. Allows for different things to shine and for the genres to push each other. So what I was just talking about with these, I'm giving one example of, the thing that fantasy romance might excuse and the thing that fantasy might excuse. But honestly, when you have some of these fantasy romances that are really, really killing it in every section of what makes up a book, a good story, and you have fantasy authors that are like, oh, okay, well, I should maybe put a little bit more effort into the relationship building. I maybe should put a little bit more effort into the friendships, because sometimes fantasy romance really does emphasize the friendships in books. And that might push authors to maybe try a little harder in certain areas. And of course, the same can be said for fantasy romance. They might be like, oh, that world was so creative, and the world building, how it was laid into the story was so effortless and perfect, and how it came back to the characters and why they are the way they are and their culture. I want to incorporate that into this, and I think that would even build these characters having to overcome these odds and everything. So I want to do that. I think the genres can really push each other while still highlighting what makes them great just by having this separation. So I think the pros outweigh the cons. I know I spent a lot of time talking about some of the cons, but I ultimately, at the end of the day, I am really excited for the future of fantasy. I'm really excited. I hope that a lot of the cons just aren't even really much of a thing, and that the pros are the things that end up coming to the forefront. I am very curious. As I said at the beginning, I would love to kind of toss this conversation over to you and allow you to express your thoughts on this. Are you so glad that you're seeing this formal distinction between them? Are you kind of sad because you feel like maybe this is going to discourage people from checking the other genres out? What are your thoughts in general? But thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.